Hello, welcome to CubsPS Plus, a Northside numbers game, a weekly podcast that dives headfirst into the analysis of hot topics driving Chicago Cubs baseball. I'm your host, Mike Waller, a lifelong Cub fan, full-time baseball stat nerd, and sometime youth baseball coach. CubsPS Plus is part of the Bleacher Bunch Productions on the Fans First Sports Network, joining great shows like the Sun Ranto Show, Cup of Cubby Blue, and Baseball Rabbit Hole. The Bleacher Bunch feed is available wherever it is you get your podcasts. All you have to do is search for Bleacher Bunch. And CubsPS Plus is always available ad-free to Patreon supporters at patreon.com/CubsPS Plus, where you can support the show and always find a variety of benefits for as little as $1 a month. In addition to the podcast feeds, you can also find me on Twitter, or X, Instagram, TikTok, Threads, Blue Sky, and YouTube, all at CubsPS Plus, a spin on the baseball metric, OPS Plus. Love the pod or hate it, please drop a review wherever it is you find your podcasts. If you've done that, thank you so much. Maybe you can share this episode with a friend. It's November 9th. We're not 10 days into the offseason, and so far, all the news in Cubs world is what the Cubs will not do. What is it they won't do? Why won't they do it? And does this remind us of off-seasons past? I have thoughts. Are you ready? I'm ready. Here we go. Welcome into episode 92. No Cub has ever worn number 92. But this offseason so far has got me thinking back to the offseason after the 1992 season. Back then it was the Larry Himes era. He was kind of Moneyball before Moneyball. So I guess this is the Larry Himes episode of this podcast, which does not get us off to a very good start. So who is Larry Himes and why has this offseason made me think of him? Well, let's start with today. So we're less than 10 days into the offseason. When the World Series ended and the Dodgers won, there was a 5-day period for all the option decisions to be made and for teams to negotiate with their own free agents. And then on Tuesday, election day, so much happened and so much I won't talk about on this podcast. Those things help determine the start of the offseason. Namely, the big one is Juan Soto. And all the reports this week, and they're just reports, no action yet. I don't think offers are on the table from anyone to Juan Soto. Rumors are teams have reached out. But the rumor in the Cubs world is that the Cubs are going to sit out the Juan Soto sweepstakes. And Corbin Burns as well, but I'll talk a little bit later about why I don't think that's as big of a deal. There are a few times where generational talent becomes available or you have generational talent on your team. The Cubs seem to be that way in 2014 to 2020, 2021. Now, as it's turned out, we've talked about it 100 times. A lot of those guys have not aged the way we thought they would. But over the years, I've been following the Cubs since the early 80s. There's been generational talent on this team. They've had Ryan Sandberg, Andre Dawson. I wouldn't say Mark Grace is generational talent, but very good player. Sammy Sosa. And everything that comes with Sammy Sosa was an it thing in baseball for like 5 years. They've had Kerry Wood, 20 strikeout game. They've had Chris Bryant coming up as his run of minor league player of the year, rookie of the year, MVP, Anthony Rizzo, but you only get a few chances to keep or add those guys. So the idea that the Cubs might be sitting out the Juan Soto sweepstakes, and again, we'll see. I tend to be a lot of Cubs writing and podcasting right now is very negative for obvious reasons. I mean, the Cubs have given us nothing to be optimistic about moving forward, other than the fact that the Cubs did not extend Jed Hoyer, at least have not yet. So it appears that this is going to be a lame duck off season. So one would think he would want to save his job and potentially make the playoffs next year. Like, I don't know, Jed, if you're thinking about it, that's kind of a good idea. But also, if you're a regular listener here, I'm not a doom and gloom guy. My natural base position is optimism. And even when there's not optimism there, I will take a look around and see, is there something to be optimistic about? Or in this huge mess, I started this podcast in the summer of 2022. Not a whole lot of optimism going on, but let's look at this guy. This player seems interesting. Is Frank Schwindel going to be a guy? Is Justin Steele going to stick as a starter? We've gotten some yeses, we've gotten some nos. But I've always held out hope that, the Cubs want to win. I make the argument that the Cubs don't spend the way I want them to spend. Like everybody else, I want them to spend like Steve Cohen spends, like the Dodgers spend. They don't. However, they do spend enough to win. And the Cubs could, with a little bit of creativity, even with Cody Bellinger opting in, the Cubs could afford Juan Soto and not have a overall team salary that much beyond where they were last year. They can. These are all choices. Choices. The Cubs are not the A's. The Cubs are not the Rays. Although ironically, the Rays have been rumored to be interested in Juan Soto. So, I mean, that could just turn the whole world upside down. The Cubs have these decisions to make, and maybe the reports are wrong. Now, the reports are coming from very, very credible Cubs baseball people that I have huge respect for. That I've seen it from a number of people, including Sahadev Sharma, who I think is one of the most level-headed Cub writers there is. So I have no reason not to believe it, and it fits their track record, frankly. I'm just hoping that there's some path here where, whether it's backlash, whether it's rethinking the idea, whether it's, Scott Boras is not going to want to cross any teams off the list. Scott Boras wants 30 teams to be all actively bidding on Juan Soto. I would, if I was an agent. So if the Cubs are not part of the process, it's because they took themselves out of the process. And that would be, honestly, it's malpractice. We'll talk about other things later, but that got me thinking. So I've had thoughts, and I've been trying to figure out how to put it together on a podcast. And I started thinking, well, I'm going to lay out some numbers, get into some statistical argument, really do like a roster breakdown. One thing I've commented on social media, they're having people that say, Tom won't let Jed go get a Juan Soto. I don't buy it. I don't. When you look at the Cubs outside of the immediate window after COVID, that was when Cubs had all that money coming due. There were no fans in the stands. There was no revenue. They looked like they might be heading into a work stoppage. And that was the time that Tom told Jed to pull back the spending for sure. The few years leading up to that, the Cubs had a top 5 payroll. I think 1 or 2 years they were top 3. So the Cubs have spent money. The Cubs spent enough money, honestly, to win last year. They outspent everybody in their division by like at least $50 million and finished 10 games behind the freaking Brewers. So it's not just spending. And I also do not believe for a second that Tom would set the budget. Absolutely. That is the owner's job. It's the owner's money. Let's all agree on a budget. And then if Jed wants to exceed that budget, their process is to go ask for permission, whatever. And the Cubs have made it very clear. Tom Ricketts has made it very clear that Jed has had more money on the table than he spent the last couple of years. He's made it very clear that the spending up to the CBT is an obvious level they should be at every year. So I don't see the Cubs pulling back spending in a big way. So to emphasize my earlier point that the Cubs could get Juan Soto and not even exceed where they are, they would have, to the idea that Tom would tell Jed, no, you can't go get a Juan Soto like contract. Let's assume, I'm pulling a big number out. The projections right now are about $600 million for Juan Soto for 14, 15 years. Let's say it goes 15 years, $700 million. Say he hits the Shohei Ohtani total. Maybe it's not deferred money and it becomes the biggest contract ever. Well, if the Cubs are going to spend at or above the CBT, the Cubs reportedly expect to go over from 2024. So clearly going over is not forbidden. Let's say the Cubs average over the next 15 years going $10 million into the first year. So for 2025, that would be a $241 million CBT level plus 10 because that's half of the first year. $250 million. Well, let's pace that out over the length of a Juan Soto contract, 15 years. And let's say the CBT increases 3 to 5 million every single year. And we only have that projection out to the end of the current CBA, and 15 years obviously is well beyond the CBA. So no telling where that goes in the future. But just working with the numbers we have, let's say that means the Cubs over the course of the next 15 years have an average annual payroll of $260 million. That would mean that over the course of those 15 years, the ownership, presumably Tom Ricketts, unless he sells the team, is going to spend $3.9 billion on player salaries. It just is. It doesn't matter who they have on the team. Like if they're going to spend at that level, That's the total dollar amount they're going to spend over the course of 15 years. It makes no sense to me in my brain that he would, out of that money, when he has typically not been a very hands-on owner, would tell Jed, no, absolutely, you can spend that money, but by all means, please do not spend it on the star. It just makes no sense in the world whatsoever. Now, if what Jed wants to do, if getting Juan Soto means that Jed might have to go to the third tier of the CBT, that's a decision that Tom might step in and say no. But there are ways you can do it. I mean, the Cubs have, I think with Cody Bellinger back on the books, I think they have about $40 million to spend. I'll have the numbers in front of me for the next episode, but you can get Juan Soto for $45-50 million. The Cubs can still clear other money off the books. We're talking a lot about trades. There are a million ways to make this happen. But it got me thinking, if the Cubs intentionally decide to sit this one out, now a bunch of teams, well, probably not a bunch of teams, a handful of teams are going to go very aggressively at Juan Soto. Only one's going to get him. So there could be a world where a different universe where the Cubs actually are aggressive and just come up short. It's going to happen to somebody for sure. That would be very different than choosing not to participate. Which really got me thinking back to, I was thinking, like, when does that happen for the Cubs? I know the Cubs reportedly put in a $500 million offer for Shohei, reached out for a contact. There was no reciprocation. Not going to relitigate that whole thing, but it was very clear from all reporting done after he signed that he was always going to go to the Dodgers. So I'm not too concerned about that, but the Cubs did stick their toe in the water at least. They took a step. But you look at some of these other ones. The Cubs were not in on Aaron Judge. They were not in on, any of these, a lot of these pitchers the last couple of years, Verlander, Cole, all those guys. Because reasons, there are good reasons, there are bad reasons, but they weren't. And you go back and I think a big part of it is I think Jed is a risk averse guy. And I think his number 2, Carter Hawkins, might actually be more risk averse than he is. And I think I prefer the dynamic when there's a little bit of yin and yang. I want to see, when the Cubs won the World Series with Theo Epstein, they had a really aggressive president of baseball operations in Theo and a more conservative, risk-averse GM in Jed Hoyer. I think that works. We saw Theo take some shots that didn't work. And some of those shots that didn't work set the franchise back and ultimately led to what happened in 2021, 2022, and beyond. And so the idea that, he can be aggressive, want to push the envelope, and then, Jed might be able to kind of pull him back on some things makes sense. I want that. So if you've got the more conservative guy, the more passive, more risk-averse guy in the lead, I want to have somebody behind the scenes that's like, Jed, go. And I don't think the Cubs have that guy right now. But it got me thinking back to, when have I seen this before? Cubs have had a lot of weird ownership over the years, up and down leadership. I mean, Jim Hendry takes a lot of crap over the years, but he made some big moves. I mean, he made some big trades. He signed Alfonso Soriano. It was a huge contract at the time. There have been times in the past where the Cubs have gotten the biggest guy on the market. But it took me back to 1992 because I was thinking about when have the Cubs made the choice not to go get the star. And in this particular case, it was keeping the star. So in the 1992 season, Cubs did not have a great season. They won 78 games, 78 and 83. It was their third straight year of just kind of floundering after winning the division in 1989, kind of out of nowhere. So, I mean, that was not a super talented team that you would think would be any kind of a dynasty. But Greg Maddux had been getting better and better and better and better. And he won the Cy Young in 1992. And his contract was up. There were attempts made by the Cubs to extend him in season during the 1992 season. And Greg Maddux said he wanted to test free agency. He wanted to see what kind of offers were out there. And so the Cubs pulled that offer back. And then when the season was over and he became a free agent, the Cubs were kind of out of contact. The Yankees made an offer. The Braves made an offer. I think we all know which one he chose there. And then Greg Maddux, after some silence, came back to the Cubs and said, hey, can you guys match this deal? And Larry Heim's answer was, no, we've already spent your money. They went out so Larry Himes, I'm going to talk about his background in a minute, but he really was kind of Moneyball before Moneyball. And this takes me back to exactly that scene in the movie with Billy Bean, obviously played by Brad Pitt, where he's talking about, we can't sign Giambi, so we have to recreate him in the aggregate. The Cubs spent Greg Maddux's money on Randy Myers, Jose Guzman, Dan Plesac, and Candy Maldonado. Candy effing Maldonado. For years and years and years and years, he was my least favorite Cub of all time. That's absurd. He would ultimately go on to become the greatest right-handed pitcher in baseball history, in my opinion. Certainly top 5 by almost any objective measure. And then maybe there are arguments that he doesn't have the career he has if he doesn't go to the Braves and get with Leo Mazzoni and all the stuff. But he was already really, really, really good with the Cubs. And he presumably wanted to stay. But we spent your money. Have some contact. And Larry Himes, had his own issues. So let's talk about Larry Himes. So Larry Himes was originally a broadcaster with the White Sox for a year before he got hired to kind of rebuild the franchise. And he had some success over there for sure. I mean, he drafted Jack McDowell. He drafted Robin Ventura, Frank Thomas, Alex Fernandez. They were able to make trades. He traded with the Rangers and got Wilson Alvarez and Sammy Sosa, Scott Fletcher, like guys who would be trade away Harold Baines in one of those deals. And that would wind up being a lot of those guys would wind up being the core of a pretty good mid-90s White Sox team. And didn't win a ring until 2005, famously, but they had some really good teams. Blackjack McDowell won a Cy Young. Frank Thomas is a Hall of Famer. That was a good team that Larry Himes built. And then the White Sox decided they got to a point where they thought he had done a good job with the rebuild, but wasn't the guy to take him any further. So they fired him. And he came over to the Cubs, and he just so much of this, I think, I don't know. There are some things here that echo forward to Jed Hoyer for me. So Larry Himes came over, and before we do the Maddux stuff, he traded for Sammy Sosa. He clearly believed in Sammy Sosa. He traded for him when he was with the White Sox, traded for him again when he came to the Cubs. It's a great deal. I mean, he traded an old George Bell to the White Sox for Sammy Sosa. But he was rubbing players the wrong way. And I don't know. Jed seems generally liked within the Cubs organization. I don't get the same personnel vibes that Larry Himes had. But there's just sort of some aimless strategy that doesn't make sense. There are reports out there. I was kind of researching, doing some Googling again to kind of refresh my brain on all things Larry Himes. And there were reports out there that he came in with a plan to rebuild the Cubs by trading Ryne Sandberg. And obviously that didn't happen. But he had this plan and started working on the deal and trying to get something done. He had never talked about it with ownership. There were reports that was the core of what it was he was trying to do. That was going to be his big first move. Ryne Sandberg coming off a really good season in 1990, was in his prime, but was hitting his 30s. And as we did see, he didn't necessarily age well into the mid 90s, but also he went through his divorce and a lot of personal things. And, as we saw with Zobrist, I mean, again, history doesn't repeat, but it does echo. There are baseball players are people. They have home problems just like the rest of us. There are times I'm going through something in my personal life and maybe I'm not as good at work. There are definitely times where I'm going through something and I'm not as good working with the kids when I coach baseball. We try to separate these things, and they're paid to be professionals and all that, but they're still people, and sometimes life is really hard, and we all have to go through it. But trading Ryne Sandberg would have been kind of trading him at peak. It would have absolutely broken me. So in 1992, I was the same age my middle son is now, as a high school senior, going into my senior year. So I wasn't the little kid I was anymore when Ryne Sandberg won the MVP in 1984, but Ryne was my guy. By this point, my best friend and I had already promised each other that, someday when Ryan Sandberg made the Hall of Fame, we were going to go for his enshrinement. And we did. We did eventually when he got enshrined, but he was my dude, and I would have been crushed at that point if they had traded him. But who knows? Who knows what would have happened? Maybe the trade would have been a good one. But it's that kind of what are we doing here sort of mentality. Like, the Cubs could have gone a bunch of different directions. Like they could have sat down with Maddux and negotiated, and Maddux maybe still would have gotten an offer he liked from the Braves, and maybe he would want to go pitch with Glavine and Smoltz. Entirely possible. Maybe the Cubs could have actually made the decision out loud that I don't remember all the intricacies of baseball's economics at the time, but maybe there was an argument that the Cubs shouldn't spend that money on Greg Maddux and should in fact go spend it on 4 guys who are honestly not that memorable. But they didn't really do anything. It just kind of sat there. It was like there was a Greg Maddux folder that Larry Himes had on his desk. It got knocked to the floor, and they sort of forgot about it until Greg Maddux called back and said, "Hey, can you redo this?" And that's kind of where I am with Jed today. Now, there's other stuff with Himes. Himes was out fairly quickly, but before Larry McPhail came in, he did not draft well in Chicago. He did not help the minor league system at all. He alienated players. Ryan Sandberg, Mark Grace, Andre Dawson all reportedly hated him. Cubs didn't offer Andre Dawson a contract after the 1992 season, hence Candy Maldonado. Now, Dawson was at the end of his career. He went on to have 4 more seasons in Boston that honestly were not that good. So maybe getting out of Andre Dawson at that point was the right call. But again, like there were concepts of a plan or whatever we want to say about that. Like it just didn't really work. And that's kind of where I am with Jed Hoyer right now. I think I know bigger picture what it is he wants to do. I mean, he's made it very clear he wants to build a self-sustaining farm system, and the farm system is a ton better than it was when he was here when he took over. He's had to make those tough decisions on the guys who won the ring in 2016. Famously, Theo kind of walked out a year early saying that there's some tough decisions that have to be made, and if I'm not going to be here, I shouldn't be the one making those decisions. But the pieces never really come together into a coherent plan. Like we're going to go young, but we haven't played the kids yet. We're interested in Matt Mervis, but let's make sure we get both Hosmer and Mancini to play first base to ensure that there's no way that Matt Mervis plays in the bigs. PCA and injuries kind of forced their hand last year. I was happy to see it, and I'll give credit. A lot of fans will criticize this point, but they did commit to finding out about Christopher Morel at third base. Didn't really work out. Now we have Itzhak Paredes, and people have a lot of different views of that trade. But there's just like it's not quite coming together. And then we look at the offseason, and Kyle Hendricks is off the books. Tucker Barnhart, Trey Mancini, Jan Gomes. There's a bunch of dead money coming off the books. Drew Smiley's money's off the books. You have a bunch of guys in the middle of the roster, frankly, are as good as they're ever going to be and maybe even on the decline. Don't have a lot of options left, aren't really good performers. So there's some money you can clear there. And they're also the Chicago freaking Cubs. I know in the last month, season ticket holders had to get their deposits in for 2025. They've already had the seat relocation services. Ticket bills are going to be due in January, and that's when the Cubs convention is coming. And it's just hard to have excitement for this team. And that's where I was kind of struggling with my thoughts this week. Like I had such a great baseball weekend last weekend. The 14U team I coach, we had the last tournament at the end of the season, and this is not some elite level baseball team, but we have fun, and the kids work hard, and they're getting better, and they're all focused on making their middle school and high school teams in the next couple of years. And I saw some things finally come together. We played well instead of having that one inning where the wheels just fall apart. Maybe we make an error, give a run away, but we don't give away 4. And they hit the ball, and they were aggressive, and it was fun. It was like everything we've taught this season kind of came together. And it was just an entire weekend at the baseball fields. It was beautiful weather. Charlotte, it was actually kind of hot on Saturday. It was pushing 80 degrees. We had sunshine and 70s all weekend. And it was just great. And I was thinking, like, baseball is so much fun. It's so much fun. And now that's over and I'm left with the Cubs. And football Saturday, so I should be locked in on college football. But Iowa lost a ridiculous game last night in LA in the Rose Bowl because the Hawkeyes haven't won in the Rose Bowl since 1959. So why would they start now? And so many of my teams are just kind of in the same spot. Like, Iowa football is pretty good. They're not an embarrassment. The offense was last year, the last couple of years, but they're going to win 8 games plus most of the time. They haven't had a losing season since 2012. The Iowa men's basketball team finishes in the top half of the Big Ten way more than it doesn't. The Cubs the last couple of years seem to be kind of on an upswing, win 83 games, but like, where's the juice? Like, for Iowa football, no top wins the last 5-6 years. No major bowl games. Certainly no playoffs this year. The men's basketball team hasn't made the Sweet 16 since 1999. The Iowa women's basketball team is really exciting, or has been, with Caitlin Clark, and I'm excited. Tomorrow I've got tickets to the Ally Tip-Off Classic here in Charlotte, where it's Virginia Tech against Iowa in the nightcap, but the first game is NC State against South Carolina. So I'm going to go watch a bunch of awesome women's basketball, and that's going to be a lot of fun. But a lot of my teams are not giving me a ton of joy. And it's like, they're good, and I'm optimistic, and I can sit down and I can make the case on why I think the Cubs are going to be competitive next year, why I think the Cubs should win the division next year. And then also, it kind of lingers, like, but do I believe it? What if something goes wrong? There's talked about expectations a lot, the projections and exceeding expectations. And a lot of this comes with, show me that you want to. I mean, I was looking at payrolls the week or so ago, and I was actually surprised. I was just kind of scanning to see any of the Cubs were top 10, like who was around them. I think back to, last year, some of this was trading Juan Soto himself, but the Padres had been so aggressive at the end of Peter Seidler's life and piled in a ton of those big contracts. Famously, Xander Bogaerts, 11 years, $280 million. Manny Machado's got a huge deal. Fernando Tatis got a big extension. They had Juan Soto for huge amounts of ARB money. And you just get to a point where I was looking at it and, like, they still have that star power, right? Like, they're a team that was pushing the Dodgers. Probably could have won, maybe arguably should have won that series. They spent less money than the Cubs did. So that takes me back to, I don't want to carry water for ownership. Cubs are owned by billionaires. They have revenue streams most teams can't dream of, and they should be spending more. But also, the money they spend has got to be spent better. And so this offseason, what are we going to do? So I talked about, Juan Soto, generational talent, kid's 26 years old, already on a Hall of Fame track. I mean, you got to play your 10 years to make it to the majors, but he's absolutely on that track. I mean, unless he just, like, falls off the planet somehow, he's going to be a first ballot Hall of Fame type player, potentially like one of the true all-time greats. And reports are the Cubs are going to sit this one out. Why? What are we doing? There are positional complications. The Cubs have a farm system with 8 top 100 prospects. Get talent and figure the rest out later. One of the positives of what Jed's done is he's stacked up a bunch of guys who are good baseball players. Now, not great baseball players, but good baseball players on very fair contracts. Outside of, a couple of the no trade clauses, like, I don't think Ian Happ would waive his. I think he's locked into staying in Chicago. Say Suzuki has a no trade, he might waive it in some circumstances, maybe. But he was also the Cubs' best hitter last year, so, I don't know. But everybody else on this team that's any good is very tradable. Nico Horner's on a very fair contract. Even Dansby Swanson's on a fair contract. Now, I think he'd be the least likely one to get traded because of the years and money left. But, Justin Steele is cheap. Jameson Tyone is paid right where he should be. Mike Talkman's a very valuable fourth outfielder. Itzhak Paredes is paid very fairly for what he does, and he has got another year of control. Ian Happ is very fairly paid. I mean, just even Cody Bellinger, like last year, it seemed like his contract would be untradeable, but the way Jed had designed that contract with the 2 opt-outs is the year 3, he takes a pretty significant pay cut. I think he goes from $27.5 million down to like 21 or 22. So that, I think that contract was always designed for him to opt out of year 3, unless we're in like worst case scenario and then the Cubs are paying less and they save a little money. And they have kids coming up that can fill bench spots, that can come in and help in the case of injury. They're MLB ready or very close to MLB ready. They've got a bunch of young pitching, a lot of young arms in the bullpen with control left. And you do those things so that you can go get Juan Soto. That's how you can get Juan Soto and still stay within the budget you set for yourself. So I don't want to make this, I mean, so much of it, Juan Soto is the big prize this offseason. And now Roki Sasaki is posted too, and that's really interesting from Japan. 23-year-old pitcher coming over with a lot of hype. Dude is good. I was looking at numbers. I think it's 540 something strikeouts and 350 innings in his 4 years in the NPB. I mean, it's ridiculous. He looked really good in the World Baseball Classic. I think he's going to come over and be an excellent pitcher. Money's not even an issue with him. You're going to pay for him out of international bonus money. He would have had to wait until the 2027 season to post and be able to come over as a full-on free agent the way Yamamoto did, or the way Shohei Imanaga did, or Seiya. For him to come over, he's going to come over effectively making the league minimum. He's going to have his 6 years working through pre-arb and arb just like everybody else. But he wants to come over. So it's going to be a posting fee, and it's, money I don't think is going to be the big issue. So I expect the Cubs to go in hard there. I know the Cubs had scouted him pretty extensively last year. I think the Cubs like him. The Cubs have done pretty well with Japanese players. The question is, where does he want to go? Does he already have a team in mind he wants to go to? Dodgers, I'm looking at you. He played for the same team that Yamamoto and Shohei Ohtani did in Japan. Don't know what the relationships are. I'm not trying to read too much into it. Apparently he's been in contact with Yu Darvish, so maybe Yu Darvish is trying to recruit him to San Diego. Shota and Seiya probably have connections to him. He has the same agent as Seiya, and maybe Shota, but definitely I know Seiya's got the same agent. So who knows? Maybe there's a connection there. He'd be a great pickup. But while this offseason is going to be so heavy on Juan Soto, for me, it's less about whether or not they get Juan Soto. There are a lot of ways to win baseball games. And there are, in the 6 years that Juan Soto has been a pro, 5 times a team without Juan Soto has won the World Series. So it's not like it's just Juan Soto or bust. For me, it's about the process. It's about going back to the Larry Himes days and just spending Greg Maddux's money without making it known that you were doing it, or that letting Greg Maddux know you were moving in a different direction. It's sitting it out is just choosing not to pursue an all-time great hitter. What are we doing? Go try to make the team better. And that's where I'm less concerned about Corbin Burnes. Corbin Burnes is 30. I think he'll be 31 at the start of next year. He's probably looking at a 6 or 7 year deal. That's absolutely warranted. Like it's fair. Like he's earned that contract. But I'm never going to be too mad about the Cubs not wanting to spend, more than 5 years on a pitcher in his 30s. And also, there's a lot of pitching available this offseason. The Cubs are in position to trade for guys. There are some really interesting arms like Max Fried, like Shane Bieber coming back from injury, Justin Verlander. There are a ton of guys you can pick up either on really short deals for big money or kind of show me deals. A lot of choices on pitching. So while Corbin Burnes is probably the top of that market, well, at least was until Roki Sasaki came in, there are other choices there. So I'm less concerned there. That doesn't bother me so much. But I just can't shake this feeling of Larry Himes. And if I'm still feeling this way by the end of the season, that probably means the Cubs didn't do a lot. And unless the team the Cubs have right now really takes off next year, it's going to be the end of Jed Hoyer, which would be fine by me. I know I sometimes come off as, I hope I don't come off too much as defending him, but I will point out the things that I think he's done well. And I do like to look at the rosier side. That's who I am and that's how I fan. But I will also look to see, like, well, for this to work, what has to go right? And that's where I break down and do my stuff. And what in an upcoming episode, I'll go back through my preseason predictions, and I got those wrong. I thought the Cubs would win 90 games. I thought they would be playing it more like a 87, 88 win pace, then make a couple of additions at the deadline to bump them up and get them to 90. I thought that would win the division. It didn't. And maybe part of the reason why Milwaukee won 93 games is because the rest of the division kind of underachieved. But, I'll go through and talk about why I was wrong, what I got wrong, and try to apply that to next year. And this is kind of starting a discussion. I think many of the upcoming episodes are going to focus on Jed Hoyer because I think he's the story of the Cubs offseason. And next week, I'm set to have an interview with Sarah Sanchez. I was guest hosting on Sun Ranto's show several weeks ago, back when the season was still going on. And she suggested that it'd be a good idea on my show to kind of go back to this time last year and take a look at who was available in the free agent market and see, could I have spent Jed Hoyer's money better? And I thought that was a really interesting idea and something that I'd have a lot of fun with. And so we're both going to do it. She's going to come on the show. We're both going to put together a roster. We'll go over the ground rules next week. But the real nuts and bolts of it is we're going to try to spend roughly the same amount of money the Cubs spent. I'm going to try not to do too much revisionist history. Like, I'm going to try to use the information I knew at the time that Jed was making these decisions and see what I can do to build a roster and see if that roster seems like it would have been better than what the Cubs had. And we'll go through the whys and the hows. And I think the big thing there is I want to talk about the process, because the process, we're right back at here again this year. Where did the Cubs come up short? It's less about, oh, I'm some super genius and I would have added this magical player for $12 million and it would have made all the difference for the Cubs. No, but it's, where did Jed's process go wrong? And what could he do this offseason, learning from that to do better? And I've got ideas. I'll also be sharing soon. I was on Bricks Behind the Ivy podcast with Jeff Rogowskis and Alex Pat last week. That episode, I think, is going to post on Monday, so I'll share that on social media when it's out there. That was an interesting one. We all kind of came with 2 free agents that we would want to, add to the Cubs this offseason. So interesting discussion. And between the 3 of us, we covered everything from Juan Soto to bench additions. So I think it's going to be interesting, again, to talk about the process and talk about the kinds of thoughts and things you have to look for when you're trying to build a team in the offseason. And that's what it's going to be. I don't expect major moves. I mean, the Cubs have, obviously, we know Cody Bellinger's in, Drew Smiley's out. They made some roster moves. They got the roster down to 40. Cubs are still sitting on a lot of guys that I think could get non-tendered. Friend of the pod, Mark Weissman, is back as a strength and conditioning coach. So he's going to be working with the major league team. I'm going to hope to get him back on this offseason. I did interview him back in 2022 before I joined Bleacher Bunch. So you'd have to go search for CubsPS Plus, find my old feed. Maybe I'll share the link again if I get some requests, but he's an interesting one to talk to. And at the time he was talking a lot about injury prevention and how to manage workloads and things like that. And I think that's very relevant to where the Cubs are today. It may be a big part of the reason why he was moving up in the Cubs organization before he took some time off and why he's back with the big league club now. I think the Cubs did not handle injuries well last year. I think the Cubs, partly because they didn't have enough depth, which is some of the process stuff we'll be talking about over the next few weeks. But too many guys were playing hurt, which, Jed talks about beating projections. A lot of guys came in under their projections last year. I think playing hurt was a big reason why. But there's a lot to talk about with the Cubs coming up. And the next big deadline to watch for is November 22nd. So 13 days from now is when tender decisions have to be made, whether or not the Cubs are going to offer those arbitration guys contracts or not. So some of the interesting decisions will be, what are they going to do with Adbert Alzolay while he recovers from arm surgery? Is Brennan Davis going to stay on the 40-man roster? Is Patrick Wisdom going to stay a Cub? What about Nick Madrigal? Like, they have a lot of really interesting decisions that are going to have ramifications for what young players they can call up and put on the 40-man. Who's going to get those bench spots? What directions the Cubs are going to go? And those will be interesting to follow. Then after that, I think it's December 5th, I think is the Rule 5 draft. So Owen Casey for sure will have to be added to the 40-man roster by the end of November, because he's Rule 5 eligible and would absolutely get taken. So we'll see. There's more to come. I don't expect any big transactions soon. The winter meetings are going to be the first week of December, like they always are. That's probably when the bulk of free agency will really get going. Hopefully the Cubs do a little more to generate excitement before Cubs convention in January, but we'll see. Sitting out Juan Soto would not be the best of signs. So hopefully, some of the backlash we've seen, and hopefully some people within the Cubs, hopefully that was just not true. Hopefully maybe some really good reporters got some bad intel, or maybe some of the backlash is going to make leadership change their mind a little bit, but we'll see. You only get a few shots at guys like that, like guys like Greg Maddux and guys like Juan Soto, and to just choose not to go after it. Yeah, it's just not the way I want my baseball team run. So go Cubs. Thank you for joining me today. If you like this episode, please drop a rating and a review wherever it is you get your podcasts, and share an episode with a friend. Just a few seconds from you gives me great feedback and helps other Cub fans find the show. You can find me on Twitter or X, Instagram, TikTok, Threads, Blue Sky, and YouTube, all at CubsPS Plus. And check out the Patreon page, patreon.com/CubsPS Plus, to help support the show. As always, the theme music for this podcast is Prospect Park West by Jerry McCoy. This is Mike Waller, host of the CubsPS Plus podcast. Every day with Cubs baseball or talking about Cubs baseball is a great day. Go Cubs!